All right, so I've discovered I think we're probably getting more online viewers now than with travel and everything. I think more people are away and watching online than in actually sitting in the sanctuary. So I want to make sure that I'm using the technology as best I can for the online viewers. But let me go ahead and get started. Two views of marriage and intimacy. Here's a problem that as I go into the song, as we start researching the song, we Christians throughout the centuries, have struggled to know what to do with the Song of Songs. I mean, I hate to put it this way, but I don't think any of the Christian church fathers would have ever written the Song of Songs. Because as Christians, we look at the song through the lens of Christian sexual morality, which is very, very different than the lens of Jewish sexual morality. And I think it took a Jewish mindset to write this song. And what I want to look at this morning is look into the minds of the Hebrews who produced the song. Then next week we'll look into the minds of the Christians who received it and interpreted it. And I think in order to grasp this song, we have to have a deep appreciation for the culture that produced it. Okay? Let me throw up a timeline up here on the screen. I'm going to have a couple timelines today. I love timelines. And I like seeing a 30,000-foot view of things. This timeline begins about 950 BC. You see Jesus there at 30, and these are all approximate dates, 30 AD. I've got 90 up there. The significance of 90 AD, and scholars are all over the board on this, but the general consensus is that around 90 AD, the Jews had a council, the Council of Jamnia, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, Council of Jamnia, and some scholars believe it was at that council that they finalized the Hebrew canon. I mean, think about this. Up until this point in time, there doesn't seem to have been a very firm statement from the Hebrew world, what is our canon of Scripture? They just had a bunch of scrolls. You look at Qumran and the caves in Qumran, you've got all these scrolls in jars, and you know, apparently depending on what cave they're in, what jar they're in, you can see the hierarchy of value. But there doesn't seem to be a list. I mean, keep in mind, you know, they didn't have a bound book that they could say, this is the Bible. They just had scrolls, Hebrew scrolls. And with those scrolls, they had an Isaiah scroll, a Jeremiah scroll. Song of Songs was part of 5 scrolls, 5 books, and I believe they were Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. I think those are the 5. And it was part of 5 scrolls, and these were like some of the last books to get included in the Bible. Esther had a hard time getting into the Bible, and in a little bit we'll see why that was. Song of Songs had a really hard time getting put into the Bible. And it took Rabbi Akiva of the 1st century at the 90 AD Council of Jamnia to say all Scripture is holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. And he saw it as one of the most wonderful books. And so his viewpoint prevailed, and it got put into the canon. The Christians came along, and they just accepted whatever the Old Testament canon was that the Hebrews put together. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of debate over that. And so then let me explain my colors there. The red line starting at 950 AD, or BC, and going just before Christ. As we saw last week, this is the range in which scholars believe the song may have been written. It may have been written as early as 950 or so BC. If it was written by Solomon, it was definitely written that long ago. Other scholars say as recently of about 200 BC. So that's the range in which it was written. That little black space between the end of the song being written and the orange space where I have allegorical, that black space is kind of a dark period. Not only in terms of no scripture being written during that time, but I can't find anybody, Jewish writer of any kind, talking about the song. It's just like it doesn't exist. In 90 AD, suddenly it exists. We hear it referenced at the Council of Jamnia. And then for the next, 1,700 and some odd years, the Christian church deals with the Song of Solomon. And they don't know what to do with it. And so they develop this history and tradition of an allegorical interpretation of the song. That this basically is not a song about two lovers in love having sexual relations outside in a garden somewhere. This is an allegory about Christ's love for his church. And that is the way the Christian church reads the Song of Songs all the way up until the middle of the 19th century. Middle of the 19th century, we suddenly get archaeological discoveries. And as we mentioned last week, there are discoveries of ancient Sumerian love poetry going back to 2000 to 3000 BC. We have Egyptian love poetry being discovered, which goes back to between 1000 and 1500 BC, which coincidentally is the time when Israel is held captive in Egypt. So scholars are speculating, well, maybe the Israelites saw these love poems being performed, because these poems were being performed. These weren't just being written down for people to sit in their living rooms and read, because the average person couldn't sit in his living room and read. He didn't know how to read. These poems were being performed in public settings. And so scholars are speculating that the Israelites may have been exposed to this while they were living in Egypt. So, starting in the mid-19th century, we have a major shift going on where the interpretation of the song is becoming less allegorical and more literal, more sensual. And this carries on throughout the 20th century and up to where we are today. But I think to appreciate this history and seeing how it all goes, we need to look at how the Jews viewed marriage and sexual intimacy and how the Christians viewed it. And so you can at least get a very good framework of where I'm heading with this study, which will be over the next 2 weeks. Here are the points I'm going to highlight. In Judaism, marriage was a highly, highly, highly exalted state, which we'll see in a second. And it was basically universal. Everybody was expected to get married. And as we'll see in a minute, they were expected to get married very young. And there are reasons for that. In Judaism, physical desire and pleasure were celebrated as part of God's original good creation. And the rules that they developed, and some of them were kind of humorous. I hope we have some chuckles this morning as we look at some of the quotes from the early rabbis. All their rules, their regulations, their ideas were designed to maximize intimacy within marriage. Okay, within marriage. Maximize it. Yes, Pastor.
I'm curious because this is a fairly new field of study for me, and I'm not real familiar. I'm neophyte with a lot of this, but I'm curious in your studies. We see some cultures where sexual pleasure on the part of the male is glorified, but it
Boy, you're pulling a Ron on me. The question from Pastor, we're going to get to that, and it is totally eye-opening. The question for those of you online that Pastor just asked is, in a lot of cultures, when we talk about sexual pleasure, the focus is on the male, and he's asking does Judaism have a focus on both together, or is there more emphasis on the female? I don't want to give you a spoiler this early, but hang in there. You're going to have your eyes opened. This is fascinating. And then when we get to Christianity, we see a totally different view. In Christianity, suddenly celibacy becomes praised and exalted. And this is not just for priests. Okay, and here, when we get to this part of it, I'm going to be emphasizing St. Augustine and St. Jerome. These were the guys who led the charge on this, at least said the most about it, and their viewpoints were adopted by the Catholic Church. Remember, back in 400 AD, all you had is a Catholic Church. And so their viewpoints were adopted, and in many respects, the Catholic Church of the 21st century still follows an Augustinian Jerome view of marriage and sexuality. Augustine primarily did not see desire and pleasure as being a part of God's good creation. He saw it as being a result of the fall. He therefore equated desire and pleasure with lust. He saw it as being sinful. He was kind enough to say it was not a mortal sin, it was just a venial sin, and Catholics understand that distinction, but it was a sin nonetheless. And I believe Augustine said something to the effect that basically every human being cannot be conceived without there being some sin involved. Words to that effect, and that's a scary thought. As a result of those views, in the Christian world, intimacy was minimized. The rules were established, and they listed all the days throughout the year that you were not allowed to have physical intimacy. And if you totaled them all up, it accounted for about 40% of the calendar year that you're not allowed to come together. So that was sort of the way it developed between Judaism and Christianity. So now what I want to do is I want to fill in some of the gaps. And to do that, let me again put some timelines up here to show what I'm looking at, my source documents and my source information. And again, 2 timelines here covering the same time period, going from 1000 BC all the way up to today, 2024, if you combine the 2 lines. So for the Jewish timeline, that's the one on top, you've got 1000 BC to 0, which I'm calling the Old Testament, and that's way loose. I mean, the Old Testament, many of the books were written long before 1000 BC, and none were written as late as 0, but just for simplicity's sake. That's the Old Testament period. Then from about 70 BC until about 700 AD, you have what is called the Rabbinic Judaism period. And this is so much fun to study. I know I'm a nerd, but this is just so much fun. What happened is, at the time of Christ, the beginning of the 1st century, you also have a whole bunch of Jewish rabbis, and we'll see several of them this morning. Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, Rabbi Akiva, I've already mentioned him, Rabbi Eleazar, who has some really fun things to say. These guys are Jewish rabbis walking around Jerusalem and in that area teaching their students. And they each have their own schools of students, their own followers, their own disciples, all the while that Jesus is doing his thing. Well, the rabbis' teachings get passed down orally. Over the next several hundred years, people start writing them down. And they write them down in collections of writings, and there are a whole bunch of them, and they have different groupings, and trying to keep track of all of this is like herding cats. You've got a group of writings called the Mishnah, and the Mishnah consists of the rabbis attempt to explain the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the law. Okay? The law was everything for the Jews, but as is the case even with American law, it sometimes needs to be interpreted, construed, figured out. And so the rabbis did that, and their teachings end up in the Mishnah. Then there's another group of writings called the Talmud. The Talmud is a rabbinical commentary on the Mishnah. Okay? And you have all these writings explaining all this stuff. And even today, if you go to a Jewish website, the one I love and highly recommend, myjewishlearning.com. myjewishlearning.com. It's a wonderful contemporary Jewish website. They've got articles on everything, and they show you the Jewish standpoint about everything. myjewishlearning.com. If you want to get into the Mishnah itself, the Talmud, and there are a whole bunch of other things. There's a collection of writings called the Midrash. If you're into Jewish mysticism, they've got the Kabbalah, just a whole bunch of Jewish writings. And there's a website entitled sefaria.org, 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 and they got it all. And it's just a huge repository of all these Jewish writings. As we dive into this, what we're going to see is that, like Christianity, there are and always were many different denominations, sects, whatever you want to call it, in Judaism. You've got your Orthodox Jews, you have your Ashkenazi Jews, you have your Hasidic Jews, you have your contemporary Jews, you have your liberal Jews. They're all over the place. And so as I share some of these things that I believe represent Jewish thought, what I was doing in my research was looking for ideas that kept getting repeated by several authors and several rabbis. When I saw things that I saw repeated over and over again, I started thinking, okay, this may be a pretty good indication of a general Jewish mindset. But if it was, just one quote scattered here and there, I sort of set it aside. I also looked for things that were quoted a lot by other Jewish authorities, and so that's what I'm going to be sharing this morning. The bottom line is the Christian line. And for our purposes this morning, the Christian line doesn't begin with Jesus. Sadly, it begins with Plato, 400 years before Christ. So much of Plato's teachings have influenced Christianity, and we just have to deal with this. And we have to be able to look into it and see, hey, does this come from the mouth of Jesus or the mind of Plato? And so we'll look at how Plato viewed marriage and intimacy. 400 AD, we've got Augustine. St. Jerome is also at that time period. 1520-ish, you get Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and so on. So on this timeline, you can see there's overlap. At the time that Augustine is sharing his views on marriage, you've got the rabbis sharing their very, very, very different views on marriage. And all this is all taking place at the same time. We're the product of the bottom timeline. So, with that, let's dive into the substance of this. For the Jews, today we're going to focus on the Jews. For the Jews, the marriage and sexuality begins with the Old Testament. And as we look into the Old Testament, it doesn't take long to realize that even setting aside the Song of Songs, the Old Testament is a really sexy book. So much so that schools are banning it from their school libraries because of its content. And it all begins back in the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1. The very first words spoken by God to Adam: be fruitful and multiply. Go make love to your wife early and often. make a lot of kids. This is God's first commandment to Adam, the first words spoken. The Jews take this very seriously. To this day, they take it very seriously. I was listening to a Christian speaker years ago, this is decades ago, and I can't remember who it was, what the context was. And this command is repeated after the flood, where God tells Noah, go be fruitful and replenish the earth. And a Christian speaker about 20 years ago said, hey, I've got news for you. The earth has been replenished. You don't have to keep doing it. Okay? And so the Jews take the view, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, very seriously. And this directs so much of their teaching. We go into chapter 2. God says it's not good for the man to be alone. The Jews interpret that verse sexually. It's not good for the man to not have a physical relational partner. So when he makes a helper suitable for him, that is a description of our physical differences that make human reproduction possible. And so then God institutes marriage. Therefore, a man will leave his father and his mother, will join with his wife, and they will be one flesh. One flesh is biblical euphemism for sexual relations. And so God defines the marriage relationship as a sexual relationship. Now, yes, marriage is more than just sex, but it's not less than just sex. Marriage scripturally is defined as a sexual relationship. And once again, the Jews take this very seriously. And they look at it. I mean, this is the first things that people are talking about in Genesis. Then we have the fall, which Augustine interprets as a sexual failing. And I'm not sure all the details of all that, but Augustine views that the fall as being a sexual sin. And then Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. What's the very next thing that we read in Genesis when they get kicked out of the garden? In Genesis 4:1. Adam knew Eve and she conceived. Some scholars suggest that this may have been an attempt by Adam and Eve to comfort one another, to console one another. Imagine the trauma of being kicked out of paradise. Okay, none of us have ever come close to anything like what they just went through. I mean, you're in paradise, you're walking with God, and now you mess up for whatever reason, and you get booted out. That trauma had to have been enormous. Some scholars believe that Adam knowing Eve under those circumstances may have been an attempt to provide comfort and consolation to one another. For whatever reason, Genesis chapter 4 begins with Adam and Eve making love. And chapter 4 of Genesis is full of people having physical relations. Throughout the Old Testament, again, just to show some of the sensuality of the Old Testament, there are a lot of things that are allowed or at least tolerated that we don't look at today. Polygamy. Chapter 4, Lamech becomes the first person to have more than one wife. It wasn't forbidden. There's, Deuteronomy warns kings not to have multiple wives because they will turn their hearts astray and everything. But there's never, throughout the Torah, never a clear prohibition against polygamy. Now, I hate myself even saying that. I don't want to say that. I don't like saying that. But as I was reading and doing the research, I realized before we get too judgmental, realize that in a lot of these situations, these are warring cultures. In warring cultures, men go off to war and they die. And in a lot of these cultures, you would have a lopsided population with many women and fewer men. And if you have a high regard for for marriage in itself, just just running the numbers would tell you that if monogamy was strictly practiced at the time, you would have many women who would never have the opportunity of getting married. And so polygamy was allowed basically for the benefit of women who wouldn't have the opportunity otherwise to have a husband. Keep in mind, in biblical Judaism, marriage was very much an economic institution. Women generally did not have independent means of making a living. They lived under their father's roofs until they got married. If dad died, they would live with their brothers until they got married. And then once they got married, they would live under the provision of their husband. And so if you were a single woman, not only were you not able to have children, but you likely couldn't even support yourself. So it was an economic reality as well. So that may have been one of the reasons that polygamy was tolerated. Then we have that whole icky stuff of concubines. It was allowed. It was permitted. You don't see a whole lot of judgmental talk. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, and there's a guy who has written a book on this. I can't remember the guy's name. I've never read the book, but I was reading a review of it. And the guy made the comment that when you read the Old Testament, if you read it honestly, it doesn't have a whole lot of moralistic comment about people's sexuality. And when you stop and think about it, and I was just looking at different stories, I thought, man, he's right. And so as I was looking through, I was thinking, okay, let me find a good story to represent this. And there were too many. I had to just pick one. Because I was looking at Lot, looking at his situation in Sodom, where the guys came and they wanted to drag his angel guests out and do things with them. And he said, no, don't do these horrible things. Here, take my 2 daughters instead. You know, he's offering to let his 2 daughters become victims of rape. And God spares Lot because he's the righteous guy. And it gets even worse after that. Yeah, Ron.
You're probably going to get to it. In Leviticus really is where we have the first light where they limit who you can or not can sleep with.
Yeah.
But that's in Leviticus.
Yeah, and Ron makes a good point. He points out, for those of you online, it's not until you get to Leviticus that we start having explicit sexual laws. All of Genesis is taking place without any clear laws from God. And so you've got a lot going on here. But even after Leviticus, and the one I want to focus on, is the story of Ruth. Here's an amazing story, okay? Now, Ruth is a book that exalts Ruth's dedication to Naomi and to Jehovah. Remember, Ruth was a Moabite woman, okay? The Moabites were the descendants of the product of Lot's union with one of his daughters, okay? Remember, Lot was rescued as being the righteous guy. The Moabites produce Ruth. Ruth marries a Jew. He dies. Okay, so now Naomi, her mother-in-law, says, go home, go back to Moab or wherever you lived, and find yourself a husband. And this is where Ruth says, no, I will stay with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Those are the wedding vows that Carol recited at our wedding. And that was really popular back in the 80s. And so Ruth is highly praised for that devotion. But look at how she finds a husband. And this whole story is recounted without any moral commentary by the writer. Naomi tells Ruth, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a bath, douse yourself with oil, perfumes, put on your best clothes, go over to Boaz. Boaz was a relative. We don't know what level of relative, but he's a relative. Go to Boaz, and while you are there, wait for him to finish eating and drinking, and wait for him to go to bed. Then go in, uncover his feet, crawl into bed next to him, and he'll tell you what to do. How many of y'all are going to advise your daughters to find a husband that way? Ruth does it, and she adds to it. She uncovers his feet, crawls into bed next to him. Just after midnight, he wakes up and looks and says, "Who are you?" "In my bed, next to me." And Ruth says, "I am Ruth. I'm one of your servants. Pull your cloak over me. Spread your cloak over me." In Jewish language, that is an offer of marriage. And it's not a proposal to marry me next week. It is a proposal to marry me now, tonight. She's offering herself to Boaz that night. And he said, "Wait, hold on." Boaz realizes that there is another relative closer to Ruth who has basically first dibs on her if he wants her. And so he says, "Hang on, no, you can stay here, you can sleep here in my bed next to me, but we're not going to do anything else." And then the next day he goes and finds the other relative and says, "Hey, she's yours if you want her." Guy says, "I don't want her." And so Boaz goes back and he marries Ruth. This whole story, with all of its sexual innuendos, is laid out in the Old Testament without any moral comment. Nobody is saying, "Hey, Ruth, what you did isn't necessarily correct." This is the Jewish culture that ends up producing the Song of Solomon. I could go on. You've got similar issues with Esther. There's no question that in the Old Testament, there was no hesitation to use sexual attractiveness to draw people together. And there's no moral condemnation of that at all. There's no indication in the Old Testament of people saying, I want you to love me for my mind." Okay? That doesn't come about. So this is the Jewish culture. So with that, let me fast forward to the rabbis. And this is where things get interesting and fun. This is actually from a later writing, but it reflects the rabbinical viewpoint. Marriage kiddushin. I'll come back to that word kiddushin after I read the quote. "It is incumbent on every man that they should marry a woman at the age of 18, and the diligent get married at 13. If 20 years go by and he has not taken a wife, the courts can force him to marry in order to fulfill the mitzvah means duty, of being fruitful and multiplying." Again, the Jews take that first command very seriously. Every man has a duty of being fruitful and multiplying. Every man is expected to get married. 18, 13, by 20. Another rabbi made the comment that if one hasn't married by 20, God lets his bones rot. The Talmud indicates that one who isn't married by age 20 will fall into the habit of inappropriate sexual thoughts, which will follow him the rest of his life. The Jews believed in marriage, and they believed in marriage at a very young age, precisely to be helpful to keep our sexual relations in their proper context. As our culture has evolved over the centuries, we find ourselves getting married at later and later and later ages. The U.S. Census, I just had it up, U.S. Census says that as of 2023, the median age for marriage of American women is 28.4 years, and for men it's 30.2 years. Wow. Yeah, that's the median age for a first marriage. And if you go through adolescence in your early teens, and your hormones start stirring in you in your early teens, and you're waiting until you're 30 to get married, that's a long time to have a heavy struggle, which results in a lot of fear, shame, and guilt. The Jews tried to avoid this by getting people married very young. Very young. And so that was one of their values. Yes?
One of the thoughts, though, that I did get, whereas there was no cap on the number of wives and things, the story of Joseph clearly lays out that adultery, taking another man's wife, early on was a moral issue.
Yeah. There's so much there. Taking another man's wife is always considered a sin in Judaism. There's so much I could go into that. I got to cut some stuff out. So let me move on. In Judaism, marriage is universal. The deliberate renunciation of marriage is all but completely alien to Judaism. This is from the Jewish Virtual Library. Scarcely any references to celibates are to be found in the Bible or in the Talmud, and no medieval rabbi is known to have lived as a celibate. They viewed marriage as sacred. Oh, I mentioned that word kiddushin. Let me go back a slide, if it will let me. Okay, there we go. Kiddushin. Kiddushin is a Hebrew word meaning holy and sanctified. And it's a word that they apply to the marriage relationship. The marriage relationship is holy. It's sanctified. Okay? And this is the only human relationship that the Jews apply this word to. That's how highly they value marriage. It is the only relationship that they apply this word to as being kiddushin, holy and sanctified. Okay, once again, nobody in Judaism is expected to be celibate. Again, Judaism has a lot of sects. There are some indications that the folks in Qumran, the Essenes, may have lived celibate lives. So you're going to have outliers, even within Judaism. Not only did they value marriage, but they saw sexual intimacy as being part of God's original good creation. I point this out because St. Augustine, St. Jerome, they saw it as a product of the fall, not as a product of the original good creation. So this writer, I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce his name, this actually comes from the 13th century, so he's a much later writer, but he reflects the attitude of the rabbis. He puts it this way: neither sexual organs nor sexual relations are obscene, for how could God create something that contains an obscenity? God created man and woman and all their organs and functions with nothing obscene in them. We believe that God created nothing containing either ugliness or obscenity. And so this was their attitude about human sexuality in general. This is why you can see all of these Old Testament books talking about physical relations between men and women in a wide range of settings, and they seem to do it without blushing. Okay? You guys don't know how much I'm struggling up here inside as I'm talking about this stuff. This is totally contrary to my upbringing, my Christian upbringing. And so for me to talk about it, I'm blushing more inside than the Jews were when they wrote about it 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. So now let's get into the area where Pastor asked his question. In addition to the marriage being kiddushin, holy and sanctified, you have what is called the marriage ketubah. Marriage ketubah. This is really fascinating. Every Jewish marriage has a prenuptial agreement, and it's called a ketubah, or ketubah. I have no idea how to pronounce it. It's the marriage ketubah, and it is a pre-marriage contract. And as you look at the contract, in fact, let me just read you. I'm going to read you a sample of the contract. You can find this online. And they have a boilerplate contract, and like with Christian vows, you can make alterations to it. But as you look at this, almost all of the obligations of the contract are placed upon the husband. The wife has very little obligations placed upon her. Okay, on the blank day of the week, the blank day of the Hebrew month of the year, blah, blah, blah. According to the manner in which we count dates here, the bridegroom, John Doe, son of whoever, said to his bride, "Be my wife according to the law of Moses and Israel. I will work, honor, feed, and support you in the custom of Jewish men who work, honor, feed, and support their wives faithfully. I will give you the settlement of," and he lists all the money he's bringing into the relationship, "which is due to you according to the law, as well as your food, clothing, necessities of life, and conjugal needs," her need for physical intimacy, according to the universal custom. The bride agrees to become his wife, and it sets forth the dowry that she's bringing into the marriage. And that's it. All of the obligations for sexual intimacy are on the husband. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he was a third century rabbi, said, "Whoever knows that his wife fears heaven and she desires him, and he does not visit her," meaning sexual relations, "he is called a sinner." He is called a sinner. It was an obligation on the husband to make sure his wife is fully sexually satisfied. The wife has no similar obligation placed upon her by the Jewish rabbis. Her obligations are absolutely silent. It's always the obligation on the husband to make sure that she is satisfied. Rabbi Shammai went so far, he's a first century rabbi. He said that a man who refuses to make love to his wife for 2 weeks in a row must divorce her. He must divorce her. The reason being, in rabbinical Judaism, if you're a divorced woman, you can get remarried. Basically, the idea is, husband, you're not satisfying your wife. You must set her free so she can find a guy who will do it. You have that obligation. Rabbi Hillel made it 1 week. If you refuse to make love for up to 1 week, you had to divorce your wife and set her free. Yes? Yep.
Was there any commentaries from the rabbis about the idea when the curse was given, that her desire should be to her husband? Did you read any commentaries on that?
Yes, it's there, it's in there. I sort of
Oh, okay.
passed over it because I just had to
I know.
trim this down somewhere. So yeah, the question was whether or not, looking at the curse, her desire will be for her husband. There are a lot of commentaries on what that means, and the ideas run the gamut. But let me sort of sidestep that question, Ron, for now, because I need to get through this. This next part is really embarrassing, and I don't know how to say it. But in Jewish rabbinical thinking, within the marriage, physical intimacy can take pretty much any form that you can imagine. And I'm going to let your imaginations take that and run with it. They did not have any restrictions on how you did it. The only restriction, and this is in Leviticus, is you can't do it when you're on your period, menstrual cycle. That's the only restriction. Beyond that, you can do pretty much anything you want. But, ladies, you'll like this. A man is forbidden to compel his wife to have marital relations. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, the same guy that we just talked about, similarly stated, whoever compels his wife to have marital relations will have unworthy children. So everything, to answer your question earlier, Pastor, everything about the rabbinic views of marital relations is all about the woman, all about the bride. It's all about maximizing her pleasure. It's all about keeping her satisfied. She has no reciprocal obligations in that regard at all. Now, I have a cynical idea in my own mind as to why she has no obligations. My cynical idea is that in Old Testament Judaism and rabbinical Judaism, the husband always had the option of taking a second wife or a third or fourth, fifth concubine. His needs, there was never a problem with finding a way to meet a guy's needs within the Jewish law, which may have been why they didn't put the obligation on the wife. Here's another interesting tidbit, and this is actually out of Exodus, I believe Exodus 21. If a man does marry a second or a third wife, he cannot thereby reduce the amount of relations he has with the first wife. So if you're making love 3 times a week with your first wife and you get a second or a third wife, you still have to make love to your first wife 3 times a week. Again, everything is about protecting the woman. I mean, in this way, you really got to have some respect for the Jews in this regard. It's all about protecting her, maximizing her pleasure. Deuteronomy, I think it's in 24, when a man gets married, he's got to stay home for a year and to please his wife. Reading all of this in context, I now know what they mean by please his wife in Deuteronomy. That's a sexual connotation there. Yeah, Ron?
Just in the story of Jacob, with his 2 wives.
Yes.
You see that played out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Jacob had his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, which is interesting. Ron mentioned the Levitical law. Jacob in Genesis married sisters. The Levitical law says you can't do that, which came along much later, obviously. And then not only did he have the 2 wives, but he also had 2 concubines. The 12 tribes of Israel are the result of 4 mothers and 1 father. I mean, that by itself just blows my mind. So let me get to this slide. This next one is just fun. Rabbi Eleazar. Okay. Sometimes when people get married, they don't know what's normal. How often should we make love? What's normal? And all this stuff. It's kind of, it makes for interesting tension. Rabbi Eleazar solved all this. First century rabbi. He was the mentor to Rabbi Akiva. And so he came up with a schedule based on a man's occupations and basically how often he expects to be at home. Okay? So if you are a sailor, and this is in the Talmud, folks. I mean, so, okay, so I'm quoting Jewish writing. If you are a sailor, you need to make love to your wife at least once every 6 months. The idea being you're sailing out the ocean blue, and you may only be home once every 6 months. Okay? It gets even funnier. Okay, if you're a camel driver, once a month, because camel drivers aren't gone as long. If you're a donkey driver, once a week. Okay? If you're a laborer and you're home all the time, twice a week. Now, if you're retired, unemployed, a man of independent means, every day. This is in the Jewish Talmud. I don't know how seriously anybody in the Jewish faith takes this. It's there. The reason it's on this screen is I've seen this quoted by so many Jewish writers of the 21st century. People love quoting this, and so I decided I need to quote it. I mean, it is, and Rabbi Louis Jacobs, I'm not sure when he lived, he makes the comment, once again, favoring the wife's needs. If, say, you are a laborer, you cannot choose to become a camel driver without your wife's permission. You cannot take a job that would result in less sexual frequency without your wife's permission. The idea being, the Jews of the rabbinical period realized that women were more concerned about intimacy than they were about money. Okay, so that's the idea. There's a lot of neat stuff in the Jewish writings, but let me finish with a rabbi's exhortation. I'm just going to throw it out here. This is a contemporary rabbi says about the Song of Songs. Keep in mind the cultural mindset of the Jewish people. He says this: if you've never read the Song of Songs in bed with someone that you love, you are missing out on one of the great religious experience that our tradition has to offer. This is the culture that produced the Song of Songs. And this is why I say I cannot imagine any of the early church fathers writing a book like the Song of Songs. It had to come from a Jewish mindset. And so as we dive into it in more depth, and we'll get there, we'll actually get to the song eventually. All this history stuff is just so fascinating to me. But hang in there, we'll get to it eventually. And when we do, I'm not going to go through it verse by verse. I'm not going to go through it and try to explain all the imagery and stuff. I'm just going to hit highlights. It's a wonderful book. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And for the Jewish leaders, the passion, the intense passion, the fierce loyalty that those lovers share with each other, along with the garden-like setting. It's like they're back in the Garden of Eden. For them, it's a truly religious experience. And I think we can learn something from our Jewish brothers here. This is neat stuff. So, I know I've done all the talking. I thank you for your patience with me this morning. Next week we're going to come back and we're going to see how all of this took a very different turn in early Christianity and see how that resulted in the treatment of the song over the next 1,800 years. So let me close this in prayer. Father, we do thank you. We thank you for the Jewish nation that came before us. And we thank you for all that they've had to say about the subject of marriage and human relations. I thank you for their wisdom in many respects. Father, I pray now that you will go with us. Help us to learn more. Help us to learn more as we dive into the song itself. Learn more of how to love one another, to learn how to have the desire for you, that intense, fierce longing that you have for us, and allow us to have it back for you and for one another. Father, I pray that you will be with us now as we go into worship, be with the worship team as they lead us, and be with Pastor as he brings the message, and be with the kids down in Faith Builders, and bless them as they learn more about you as well. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.